shoulders. Cold air pooled at the bottom, oddly stale and heavy. When my boots touched ground, the silence of the canyon pressed into my ears like cotton. My flashlight beam sliced across the sandstone walls as I moved forward, scanning for any sign of the missing hikers. At first, everything seemed routine. After nearly an hour, I spotted a jagged piece of nylon wedged into a narrow crack, the torn edge of a tent pole nearby. Equipment damage wasn't unusual in tight canyons, but my gut twisted slightly. This gear had been violently shredded, as though pulled apart rather than snagged. I continued deeper, reaching a section of the canyon where the walls squeezed inward, creating a claustrophobic passage. As I pressed through, my flashlight caught an irregular stain smeared across the sandstone floor. Dark crimson streaks trailed deeper into the canyon, unmistakably fresh. Blood. The coppery scent lingered in the air, sour and unmistakable. Instinctively, I reached for my radio and thumbed the button. "Base, this is Ranger Holt. I've got blood evidence roughly 1 mile in, no visual on missing party yet. We'll proceed cautiously. Please, acknowledge." Static buzzed quietly back at me. No response. Typical. Signals rarely penetrated this deep. Alone was exactly what I was now. I advanced slowly, senses alert, heart quickening. Ahead, the blood trail became clearer. Drag marks, broad and deliberate, as though someone had been pulled bodily across the rocky floor. The narrow passageway twisted sharply ahead, creating blind corners. I stopped, forcing slow, measured breaths, listening carefully. That's when I heard it. A faint but distinct thudding from deeper in the canyon. Not rockfall, not distant thunder. Too rhythmic, too steady. Footfalls, heavy and purposeful, like bare feet slapping against sandstone. Every step echoed softly, reverberating gently off the canyon walls. They stopped abruptly whenever I halted, then resumed as soon as I moved again, always ahead, always just beyond sight. My hand instinctively moved toward the grip of my sidearm, fingers curling tightly around its handle. Something was down here with me, in this twisted maze of rock and shadow. My rational mind scrambled for answers. A lost hiker, delirious and stumbling, an injured animal disoriented. But the cold, primitive fear rising inside me said otherwise. Something was deeply wrong about those footsteps. I pressed forward, deeper into the narrowing passage, following the blood trail and the steady rhythm of feet I could never quite see. Every nerve screamed at me to turn back, to retreat to daylight and fresh air, but I couldn't. Not yet. Lives depended on me finding answers. Ahead, the canyon tightened again, forcing me to angle my shoulders sideways and squeeze painfully between sandstone walls. My flashlight flickered briefly, then steadied, illuminating another piece of torn gear, a shredded backpack, emptied of its contents, cast aside like refuse. I paused, staring at the torn fabric, heart hammering. Whoever or whatever had done this was strong, powerful enough to tear through nylon and plastic like tissue paper. I glanced again at the blood trail, smears darkening into near blackness as the gulch grew dimmer around me. With dread crawling up my spine, I took another step forward, feeling the canyon walls close around me like a tomb. The deeper I pushed into the gulch, the tighter it squeezed around me. What little sunlight had made its way into this twisting slot canyon now faded entirely. My flashlight became a lifeline, slicing through the thickening darkness. But even its powerful beam couldn't reach far enough to offer comfort. I'd stopped hearing the footsteps, but that brought no relief. The silence felt worse. I strained to listen for any movement, any sign that might help me make sense of the growing dread. My heart was pounding, adrenaline keeping my senses sharp, hyper-aware of every scrape and scuffle of my boots against the canyon floor. Then, in the dim edge of my flashlight's reach, I saw something wedged against the sandstone wall. Moving closer, my breath caught as I recognized the remains of a sleeping bag, torn apart with unsettling force. Its synthetic fibers were shredded and clumped together, stained dark red where something or someone had rested. No footprints, no sign of struggle. Just more of those eerie drag marks that continued further into the canyon's twisting shadows. My mind raced through possible explanations, but none fit neatly into reality. Animals didn't drag people cleanly away without leaving claw marks. Flash floods left debris and mud. They didn't carefully scatter belongings like a morbid scavenger hunt. Every rational thought I had crumbled against the sight in front of me. I turned around abruptly, deciding I'd seen enough. I would call in backup, let a full team handle whatever was happening here. But as I backtracked through the narrow passage, I immediately felt disoriented. Junctions I'd never seen appeared around every turn, splits in the canyon walls that hadn't existed before. My sense of direction started unraveling rapidly, panic clawing at the edges of my thoughts. This was impossible. I'd trained extensively in these canyons. My instincts for navigation were solid. And yet, every turn I took seemed to shift and warp, funneling me deeper into unfamiliar territory. Each step felt heavier, each twist more alien than the last. My flashlight flickered suddenly and died, plunging me into absolute blackness. I fumbled quickly with trembling hands, pulling spare batteries from my vest pocket. After struggling in the dark, fingers trembling with urgency, I managed to snap them into place and switched the flashlight back on. The beam returned, but dimmer, fogged by something smeared across the lens, sticky and oily. It blurred the light into a hazy, sickly halo. Gritting my teeth, I continued forward. Ahead, scattered clothing appeared. Shirts, pants, jackets, all turned completely inside out and neatly placed in piles along the canyon floor. Boots sat lined up beside them, perfectly paired, empty and undamaged. It felt staged, purposeful, more chilling than if they'd been violently shredded. The scene made no sense, defied logic entirely, and deepened the sense of dread now coiled tightly around my chest. Then, further on, my light caught a smear on the sandstone wall at shoulder height. I stepped closer, shining the hazy beam directly onto the surface. It was a handprint, impossibly elongated and wide, each finger trailing downward as if whoever left it had slid slowly along the wall. It was deep red, fresh enough to glisten wetly in my weakened flashlight. I backed away quickly, heart racing wildly. My rational mind collapsed beneath the weight of fear, replaced by a primal need to escape. Panic surged as I desperately searched for a way out. A short distance ahead, the passage narrowed dramatically into a steep chimney chute, my only possible route upward. Without hesitation, I began to climb, fingers gripping sandstone edges, muscles straining to haul myself upward, driven purely by survival instinct. Halfway up the chimney, a sound broke the silence below, a deep rasping intake of breath, long and ragged, unmistakably human but distorted somehow. It echoed upward, reverberating along the stone walls, freezing me in place. Cold sweat dripped down my spine, every muscle locked. Then came sudden searing pain. My shoulder wrenched violently as I overextended, a sickening pop radiating through my bones. I bit down hard on my tongue to stifle a scream. My shoulder was dislocated, useless at my side. Gasping, I wedged myself awkwardly against the sandstone wall, and bracing for agony, slammed my shoulder into the rock. The pain exploded through me, vision momentarily whiting out, but the joint slid mercifully back into place. Breathing shallow, vision swimming, I forced myself upward again. Below me the breathing continued, patient and waiting. With every ounce of remaining strength, I pulled myself higher, desperate for open air and escape from whatever nightmare lurked beneath. I dragged myself out of the chimney chute, collapsing onto the rocky ledge above. My injured shoulder burned with a deep, throbbing ache, every movement sending sharp jolts of pain through my entire body. Sweat dripped down my forehead, mingling with grit and blood, stinging my eyes as I struggled to steady my breathing. The twilight sky overhead was fading quickly into nightfall, painting the horizon in shades of deep violet and crimson. Despite the exhaustion that threatened to pin me down, I knew staying here meant death. Whatever was in that canyon could easily follow. It was only a matter of time before it caught up. Using my good arm, I crawled forward, moving inch by painful inch, until I reached an exposed shelf of rock that overlooked Wire Pass. My hands shook as I pulled the emergency flare from my pack, fumbling to activate it. With trembling fingers, I pointed the flare skyward and ignited it, sending a fiery red streak high into the darkening sky. The flare illuminated the canyon walls briefly, casting sharp shadows before fading away, leaving me alone again in the encroaching darkness. Time stretched painfully, each second passing like an eternity, until finally I heard voices echoing from above. My teammates had seen the flare. Shouts grew clearer as flashlights appeared along the canyon rim, beams slicing through the darkness toward me. Relief flooded through my veins, breaking the tension that had gripped my body. "Travis," someone yelled. "Hold tight, we're coming." Within moments they reached me, faces pale, eyes wide with shock at my battered state. Questions spilled rapidly from their mouths, but I silenced them quickly with a raised hand. "Don't go down there tonight," I warned, my voice raw and trembling. "You need to wait for daylight, full teams only." As they strapped me onto the litter and began carrying me up the rocky incline toward safety, I felt my heart rate finally start to ease. Still, my mind couldn't shake the images burned into memory. The crimson stains, the twisted gear, that impossible handprint. Something unknown and malevolent waited down there, deep in the gulch, and I feared it would always remain unexplained. Back at base camp, under bright fluorescent lights, they carefully examined my injuries. The medic cleaned and bandaged my wounds, tending to my shoulder and administering painkillers that dulled the throbbing ache to a muted pulse. Despite protests, I refused sedation until I could show them the footage from my body camera. I needed them to see, to believe, so they wouldn't dismiss my story as delirium or panic. We gathered around the small screen in tense silence, the footage playing clearly at first. My descent, the shredded equipment, the blood trails, even faint glimpses of movement just beyond the edge of my flashlight. My stomach clenched when the recording reached the final minute. Static erupted, blotting out the picture for a brief moment. And when clarity returned, the canyon was silent and still. Then abruptly, a scream tore from the audio, desperate, human, filled with raw terror. The recording cut off sharply, plunging us all into stunned silence. That scream wasn't mine. At sunrise the next morning, drones buzzed over Buckskin Gulch, cameras scanning every shadowy crevice and dark alcove. The search teams found no bodies, no survivors, only the shredded gear and crimson stains I'd seen with my own eyes. The drag marks ended inexplicably against smooth rock walls, offering no answers, only deepening the mystery. Days turned into weeks without resolution. Official reports marked the hikers as missing, presumed dead, with no explanation offered. When I finally submitted my resignation 6 weeks later, citing lingering trauma, no one questioned it. My fellow rangers had watched that footage with me, seen the unexplained horror firsthand. They knew why I couldn't return. I left Buckskin Gulch behind, but I knew the truth would stay with me forever, etched into my mind like the scars on my shoulder. Whatever had taken those hikers was still down there, hidden within the twisting shadows, quietly waiting for the next group to descend into its grasp. I've worked the backcountry of Bridger-Teton National Forest for nearly 12 years, and thought I'd seen just about everything the Wyoming wilderness had to offer. Bear maulings, lost hikers, flash floods. I'd been there, dealt with it, and moved on. So when I got the call about the elk carcasses up in the Gros Ventre Range, I expected wolves, maybe even poachers. What I didn't expect was something I couldn't easily explain. It was late October, cold already settling into the valleys, and I was helicoptered in to investigate reports that had shaken up even the most seasoned hunters. Elk had been found dead, not just killed, but arranged in patterns, deliberately posed. It wasn't predation, it wasn't human, at least not normal human activity. It was something else entirely. The chopper set me down near a high-altitude meadow around mid-morning, the air brittle enough to catch in my throat. Snow dusted the ground, melting in thin patches beneath the sun's pale rays. I watched the helicopter shrink against the sky, the rhythmic beat of its rotors fading, leaving me alone in a vast stretch of rugged terrain. My gear was simple, a week's worth of supplies, my rifle, and enough determination to figure out exactly what had hunters spooked enough to call off their trips mid-season. I moved cautiously through the timberline, eyes scanning for signs of wildlife or disturbance. After hours of silent hiking, I reached the first reported location. The sight stopped me cold. It wasn't the smell of death. I'd gotten used to that years ago. It was the arrangement itself. 5 adult elk, placed in a near-perfect circle, legs extended outward, heads twisted around so that their antlers formed a crude, interlocking pattern. Their chests were neatly split, ribs pried open. Even more unnerving were the entrails, which had been removed and placed neatly around the circle in concentric rings, forming a grotesque halo. This wasn't random, it was precise, intentional, and deeply unsettling. I stepped closer, trying to make sense of it. Wolf kills were messy, chaotic. Bears didn't bother organizing their prey. Human poachers took antlers or meat and left the rest scattered. But this was methodical and left no tracks. No footprints, no drag marks. Nothing to show how these massive animals had been moved or manipulated. I documented the site carefully, photographing and taking notes for my report. Something primal tightened in my chest, and I knew instinctively that whatever had done this was still close. The forest around me grew oppressive, each rustle of leaves sending adrenaline coursing through my veins. I glanced at the map, confirming that my next destination was the ravine. Locals called it Deadman's Notch, a name whispered rather than spoken, and usually avoided. Old-timers had stories, vague warnings about something that lived deep inside it. But I didn't have the luxury of superstition. My job was evidence and explanation, not stories. As I climbed higher toward the ravine, daylight thinned, shadows deepening around me. A strange noise broke the stillness, echoing from the distance. A scream, but distorted, unnatural. It was animalistic, yet disturbingly close to human. It rang out twice, identically each time, like a perfect mimicry. I paused, rifle instinctively at the ready, my breathing shallow. Silence returned, heavy and absolute. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the chill that ran down my spine. Rational explanations fought for dominance. Mountain lion, injured elk, trick of the wind through the gorge, but my gut told me otherwise. By the time I set up camp near the edge of Deadman's Notch, darkness had settled thickly around me. I made a quick meal, careful not to leave scraps to attract wildlife, and climbed into my tent. Despite exhaustion from the hike, sleep wouldn't come. Every subtle noise from outside became louder, magnified. I lay awake, ears strained, pulse quickening at the smallest sounds. Hours dragged by before exhaustion finally took hold. But just as I drifted off, something brushed across the top of my tent, heavy enough to sag the fabric. My heart slammed against my ribs. I grabbed my rifle and threw myself outside, flashlight piercing the darkness. Nothing. No movement, no tracks. Only my own shallow breathing disturbed the air. My gaze traveled slowly around the perimeter of camp. Something was off. My boots were missing from beside the tent. I spent several frantic minutes searching, panic rising, before spotting them nearly 40 yards away, tucked into the fork of a tree. When I reached them, my stomach twisted. Each boot was filled to the brim with cold, dense mud, packed firmly as if by strong, meticulous hands. I stood there frozen, a wave of realization washing over me. I wasn't alone out here, and whatever was out there had made it clear. It knew exactly where I was, and exactly how vulnerable I had become. I spent the next hour sitting by the dying fire, my mind racing. I couldn't find an explanation that made sense. An animal wouldn't move my boots, let alone fill them with mud and place them neatly in a tree. And a human. I didn't even want to consider that possibility, but who else was there? Sleep was impossible now, the tension coiled too tightly within me. I decided to use the remainder of the night productively, checking gear, repacking supplies, and trying to stay focused. As dawn broke, cold gray light filtered through the trees. I quickly dismantled camp, eager to move and regain some feeling of control. By mid-morning, I descended carefully into Deadman's Notch. The ravine was deeper than I'd anticipated, jagged cliffs rising steeply on either side, funneling shadows along the narrow floor. Moss-covered rocks slick with frost made footing dangerous, and every step echoed with unsettling clarity. Halfway down, something caught my eye on a shelf of rock partially hidden beneath an overhang. My breath stalled in my chest. There, tucked beneath a canopy of branches and elk hide stretched tight across a crude framework of saplings, stood a rough shelter. It blended eerily with its surroundings, camouflaged by weather and shadow. I approached cautiously, rifle held tightly in one hand. As I drew nearer, the details sharpened into grim reality. Bones littered the area, stacked loosely in piles. Each one was cracked open, emptied of marrow, some with flesh still clinging to the joints. The scent of decay hung thick in the chilled air, sharp enough to sting my nose. I knelt, studying the bones. They weren't cut with knives or saws. They had been broken by blunt force, methodically and with precision. My heart thumped painfully as I noticed several strips of tattered fabric mixed into the bedding inside the shelter. The torn edges suggested outdoor gear, faded camouflage cloth from jackets, fragments of wool and nylon. A shiver crawled up my spine as I realized these could be remnants of hunters' clothing, gear belonging to people who had disappeared or fled, leaving behind only fragments to indicate they'd ever been there. Panic crept closer, twisting coldly within me. I rose quickly, backing away, eyes darting around the ravine walls. That's when I saw it. A sudden flicker of movement at the corner of my vision, high above on the opposite side of the gorge. I spun around, raising my rifle instinctively. Nothing there. Just trees, rocks, shadows. My pulse drummed hard in my temples, each heartbeat echoing inside my head. The silence was oppressive, closing around me like an unseen hand, pressing down until breathing felt difficult. I forced myself to move again, desperate to get away from that awful shelter and whatever had built it. My sense of direction blurred, anxiety gnawed at the edge of reason, yet I knew I couldn't panic now. The climb out was steep, dangerous even without my nerves fraying. As daylight faded rapidly, my campsite from the night before felt impossibly distant. The sky darkened to a dull, bruised purple, shadows stretching deep and long between the trees. Each crackling twig, each rustling branch became magnified, sharpening my paranoia. But there was nothing visible, just an endless void of quiet menace. I finally reached my camp as darkness fully took hold. I rebuilt the fire quickly, gathering wood and stoking flames high enough to push back the suffocating blackness. My eyes searched the tree line obsessively, hyper-aware of every shifting shadow. Late into the night, as exhaustion battled anxiety, I drifted in and out of uneasy sleep. Around midnight, something stirred me awake, a faint sound that broke the monotonous crackling of the fire. My body went rigid as I listened. Slowly, painfully slowly, the sound clarified into something distinct. Slow, rhythmic breathing, not my own. It seemed to come from just outside the glow of the firelight. Hands trembling, I reached silently for my rifle. Sweat beaded on my forehead despite the biting cold. I stared into the darkness, eyes wide, straining for a glimpse of movement. But nothing revealed itself. Minutes stretched endlessly, my breathing shallow, every nerve ending on fire. Then, without warning, the breathing stopped abruptly. Silence returned, heavier than before. Somehow that was worse. I waited until dawn broke again, eyes gritty and burning from lack of rest. As pale sunlight finally washed across the trees, my gaze fixed numbly on the ground just outside my tent flap. 2 bare footprints marked the frost-covered soil, clear and human-like, but something about their shape felt subtly wrong, elongated, distorted, as if made by something only pretending to be human. The realization sank deep into my bones, settling cold and unshakable. Whatever was stalking me through Dead Man's Notch, it wasn't merely hunting, it was studying me. By morning, I was barely holding it together. My body felt worn thin from sleeplessness, fear, and exhaustion. Every rational explanation I'd clung to had slowly unraveled over the past 2 nights, leaving behind only dread. Whatever was out here with me had no fear of being discovered. It was stalking me, mimicking my movements, learning my habits, and worst of all, letting me know it could reach me whenever it chose. I knew I had to get out. Returning to my original drop-off point would take most of the day, but remaining in this place was no longer an option. I quickly packed what essentials I still had, abandoning everything non-essential to lighten my load. As I walked, my eyes darted across the landscape, pulse quickening with every shifting shadow. I'd hiked for hours when I finally reached a rocky overlook above the gorge, pausing briefly to orient myself. My nerves buzzed with an uneasy awareness, as if being watched by something I couldn't yet see. I glanced up from my map and froze. Across the ravine, about 300 yards away, a figure crouched on a rocky ledge, staring directly at me. Through my binoculars, the breath caught painfully in my throat. It wore my ranger jacket, identical in color and style, complete with the familiar patches on its sleeves. The same boots, stance, and even the same posture mirrored my own. My hands shook as I raised the binoculars higher, desperate to identify who or what was watching me. My stomach turned as I brought the figure's face into focus. It was me. My face, my short hair, the faint scar on my cheek, all of it was there. Yet something was horribly off. The eyes sat too far apart, cold and vacant. The mouth hung slightly open, lips slack, like an imitation missing critical details. Its head cocked slowly to one side, mimicking my exact posture as I shifted my weight. I lifted my rifle, pulse pounding, trying to steady my shaking hands. I aimed just above its head, hoping a warning shot would send whatever it was fleeing. The sharp crack of the gun echoed across the gorge, but the thing never flinched. It remained motionless, its eyes fixed unblinkingly on me. A cold, sharp wave of terror flooded me as I watched the figure drop silently onto all fours and scurry impossibly fast back into the shadows of the rocks, its limbs moving in jerky, unnatural motions. I didn't wait. Instinct overtook reason, and I turned and ran, lungs burning, branches slapping my face. Every snapping twig and rustling bush behind me pushed adrenaline through my veins, urging me faster. The creature stayed parallel, tracking me through the trees, its distorted shape glimpsed briefly in flashes between branches, pacing me effortlessly. I skidded downhill toward the river, legs shaking from the brutal pace. At one point, I risked a glance over my shoulder. My stomach churned when I spotted the thing again, closer now, its mouth wide open, like it was screaming, but no sound escaped. I stumbled and nearly fell, but forced myself upright and kept moving. The river appeared ahead, wide and churning, a ribbon of salvation cutting through the forest. Without hesitation, I plunged into the icy water. Cold seized my chest, numbing instantly. The current yanked me downstream, pulling me beneath the surface. My lungs screamed for air as I fought to stay afloat, driven by desperation more powerful than exhaustion. Minutes stretched into eternity, the rushing water sweeping me along until finally, gasping and coughing, I dragged myself onto the muddy shore downstream, limbs trembling uncontrollably. Night fell swiftly, wrapping the wilderness in oppressive darkness. But I kept moving along the riverbank, driven by the singular urge to survive. Every rustle, every cracking branch set my heart racing again, but nothing emerged from the darkness. Eventually, my battered body collapsed on the rocky shoreline, utterly spent. By sunrise, a Wyoming Fish and Game Patrol boat found me shivering violently, scratched, bruised, and barefoot. They brought me in, silent and staring vacantly into the distance, struggling to articulate what I had witnessed. Back at headquarters, the dashcam footage from my patrol truck had been erased entirely, leaving only static behind. Without video proof, all I had were my notes, sketches, and the unsettling memories seared into my mind. I wrote a brief, guarded report, carefully avoiding speculation. Officially, it was logged as an unidentified threat, but privately among rangers, I warned them to avoid Dead Man's Notch at all costs. I've since refused to patrol alone. Bridger Teton quietly restricted access to the gorge, citing environmental recovery. But late at night, lying awake, my thoughts returned there again and again. I know now with bitter certainty that what crawled out of that ravine remains hidden, waiting patiently for the next person brave or foolish enough to wander into its territory. Palo Duro Canyon was never forgiving. In July, under a sun that blistered the red rock and cracked the dry earth, it became downright hostile. The heat clawed at your throat, stole moisture from your eyes, and turned the most seasoned hikers into stumbling, mumbling shells of themselves. Most visitors underestimated it, arriving with flimsy water bottles and cheap sandals. They came here looking for postcard-perfect views, only to leave humbled, if they left at all. I knew the canyon well. I'd been a Texas State Park ranger here nearly 10 years, a lifetime after serving as an Army medic. I'd patched up snake bites, twisted ankles, heat stroke victims. After a while, you thought you'd seen it all. But the truth is, the canyon was always waiting with something new, something worse. That summer, July brought more than record-breaking heat. It brought disappearances. 3 campsites abandoned within 2 weeks, campers gone without a trace. No signs of struggle, no scattered gear, just silence. A cold sense of unease had crept through the ranger team, though nobody spoke openly about it. Maybe because we all remembered the whispered local legends. When storms came in summer, shadows moved along the canyon walls, shadows tall and unnatural. I tried not to dwell on ghost stories. Rangers didn't indulge superstition. But there was something about this July I couldn't shake. It was a Tuesday when the call came in. 2 hikers, a brother and sister from Lubbock, were overdue by 2 days from their planned hike along the Rock Garden Trail. A volunteer spotted their old Subaru parked at the trailhead, untouched. The visitor center raised an alert, and I headed out at dawn to investigate before the sun became unbearable. My patrol mule, Rosie, knew the trails as well as I did. She plodded patiently as we climbed higher into the canyon, navigating narrow paths and rocky slopes. By mid-morning, the air was shimmering with heat, and the sun beat down like a hammer. When we reached the campsite, my stomach tightened. 2 tents stood intact, sleeping bags laid open as if the occupants had just stepped outside. A loaf of bread sat half-eaten on a cooler, already swarming with ants. Water bottles, maps, guidebooks, everything was still here. Nobody packs for a hike and leaves all their gear behind. I radioed headquarters, but the line was static. The canyon's sheer walls often killed reception. Sighing, I climbed higher to find a signal, glancing at the towering cliffs around me. My breath caught. Halfway up, a sandstone face was something dark, something unnatural. Carefully picking my way through loose rock, I moved closer, squinting in disbelief at what I found. 3 deep gouges, each 6 feet long, and spaced evenly apart, carved neatly into the rock. They looked fresh, the edges sharp. Too precise to be animal claws, too powerful for a human prank. An uncomfortable shiver ran down my back despite the heat. Instinct made me glance quickly over my shoulder at the empty canyon behind me. I took a shaky breath, feeling very exposed on the narrow ledge. Whatever did this had strength and reach. On the way back to the campsite, Rosie froze, ears flattened. She pawed nervously at the ground, refusing to continue toward the dry wash we'd crossed earlier. A foul scent drifted on the breeze, something dead and ripe baking in the sun. Animals died here all the time, but Rosie had never reacted this badly. She was usually steady, unflappable. I trusted her instincts. We circled around, choosing another route back, eventually settling into a different clearing for the night. The sun sank behind the canyon walls, plunging us into an oppressive darkness. No moon tonight, only thick, choking shadows that seemed to press inward. I ate a cold dinner and bedded down under the stars, unable to shake the feeling of eyes watching me from the blackness beyond the firelight. Sleep refused to come. I lay awake, listening to the silence of the canyon. Sometime after midnight, Rosie's terrified braying jolted me from my thoughts. Scrambling up, flashlight in hand, I sprinted toward the sound. Rosie was thrashing violently at her tether, her cries abruptly silenced by a sickening crunch. The beam of my flashlight found her immediately. She lay crumpled, throat savagely ripped open, eyes wide and glassy. Her legs were bent grotesquely beneath her, as if something had snapped them with brutal force. Bile rose in my throat. My flashlight trembled in my grip as I searched frantically around me. There were deep indentations in the ground, too long, too widely spaced for human feet. Something large and heavy had moved quickly here, silently approaching the camp, killing Rosie before retreating into the darkness. I stood frozen, my heartbeat roaring in my ears, realizing for the first time in my career that I wasn't alone in the canyon. Something else was out here, something violent, powerful, and utterly unknown. And whatever it wasn't finished yet. I sat in the cramped ranger station, staring at my shaking hands. My supervisor, Mark, paced slowly in front of me. The room smelled of stale coffee and sun-warmed maps. I'd spent all morning filling out paperwork about Rosie's death. Mark had insisted I take some personal days, but that felt impossible. I couldn't just go home and pretend the canyon hadn't changed overnight. Instead, I found myself buried in old incident logs, searching through yellowed pages that smelled of dust and mildew. Maybe it was just denial, or maybe I was desperate for something, anything, to explain what had happened out there. Either way, I was convinced I wasn't the first person in Palo Duro Canyon to see something they couldn't explain. I found scattered notes buried deep in the archives. Entries from the 80s described campers vanishing during heat waves, their gear left untouched. A ranger named Roy Mendoza had written about strange marks along the rim, dated July 1999. Then there was a vague reference to something the older locals called La Sombra del Cañón, the shadow of the canyon. The notes were frustratingly brief, but the common thread was clear. Campers disappearing without reason, strange markings on canyon walls, sightings no one could prove. That evening, as the sun sank low over the horizon, painting the sky deep shades of orange and violet, I found myself packing. Not the gear I'd usually take on routine patrol, but heavier equipment. My service pistol, a flare gun, an emergency beacon, and night vision goggles I'd borrowed from the station's supply closet. I didn't check out the gear properly. I didn't want anyone asking questions. Rangers didn't go hunting folklore. They'd say the heat was getting to my head. But something was out there, and I couldn't shake the image of Rosie's broken body, the gouges carved into the stone, or the feeling of something close by, just beyond the reach of my flashlight. I headed out on foot this time, moving slowly toward Capitol Peak, avoiding trails where hikers or fellow rangers might spot me. The sky darkened fast, clouds swirling overhead, promising a storm that wouldn't bring rain, only heat lightning crackling silently. The hot air clung to my skin like a fever. After a grueling climb, I reached a shallow cave I knew from patrols. Settling into the narrow alcove, I waited, night vision goggles heavy on my head, sweat stinging my eyes. Hours ticked by in silence. The storm finally gathered overhead around 2 a.m, lighting the canyon in eerie greenish bursts. During a particularly intense flash, something moved across my vision. I froze, heart suddenly pounding in my ears. Adjusting the goggles, I scanned the opposite ridge. Another flash lit up the night, and there, silhouetted against the sky, stood a shape. My pulse quickened and my breath caught painfully in my throat. It was tall, easily 7 feet, with limbs unnaturally long, almost skeletal. The storm flickered again, and for a moment I caught a glimpse of its skin, pale and stretched tight across its frame, face hidden in shadow. I fought down panic, my breath shallow, each inhale barely filling my lungs. Whatever this was, it wasn't human or animal, not any species native to the canyon. It lingered, unmoving, like it was waiting, watching. Then darkness fell again. My heart hammered as I blinked sweat from my eyes, frantically adjusting the goggles. When lightning illuminated the ridge once more, the figure had vanished. My hands shook as I forced myself to breathe steadily, counting seconds between lightning flashes. Nothing moved. Only silence filled the gap. At sunrise, exhausted and tense, I left the cave and cautiously made my way down toward the dry wash below Capitol Peak. As I moved, I noticed something dark trailing along the canyon floor, streaks of dried blood. The trail was easy to follow, winding through the wash and ending abruptly at a narrow rock chute. The opening was tight, barely wide enough to squeeze through, but I pushed inside anyway, skin scraping against the rough stone walls. Wedged inside, I found an abandoned backpack, the missing hiker's pack from Lubbock. My throat tightened. Carefully, I opened it, finding sealed granola bars, sunscreen, an unopened water bottle, and a guidebook. No wallet, no keys. Beside it lay something else, bones, broken and scattered, unmistakably human. I stumbled backwards, stomach churning, fighting the urge to be sick. I grabbed my radio and called in, desperation coloring my voice. "Headquarters, this is Ranger Luis. Do you copy?" Static hissed back, empty and lifeless. "Headquarters," my voice broke. I tried again, voice thick with dread, only more static. I was completely alone, trapped in the heat-ravaged canyon, aware now that the missing campers hadn't simply wandered off. They'd been taken, killed. And whatever had killed them was still out here, waiting for nightfall. Night came swiftly, and the darkness fell like a heavy curtain over the canyon. I sat alone near the mouth of Sunday Creek, feeling vulnerable beneath a thick blanket of clouds. Thunder rumbled in the distance, angry growls promising a storm, but no rain fell. Instead, flashes of dry lightning illuminated the canyon walls in brief, disorienting bursts of white-hot light. Each flash left bright afterimages dancing behind my eyelids, twisting my vision into confusion. I had stopped trying the radio hours ago. It yielded nothing but meaningless static. My leg ached from a scrape I'd picked up crawling through that narrow chute. Sweat stung the cut, and every move sent fiery jolts up my thigh. Still, I knew staying still meant dying. I kept low, flashlight gripped tightly, moving cautiously through the loose gravel in the dry wash. My heartbeat felt loud enough to echo off the walls, and I forced my breaths shallow and controlled, fighting to steady my shaking hands. Nothing stirred around me, no insects, no breeze, only the oppressive silence between claps of thunder. Then came a sound so quiet it barely registered, a subtle shift of gravel just behind me. I spun around, raising the flashlight, but the weak beam found nothing except empty space and dust particles floating in the air. My pulse hammered at my temples. Another flash of lightning split the sky, and the canyon lit up in stark detail. Ahead of me, crouched low behind a cluster of mesquite shrubs, was a shape. Too thin, too tall, limbs folded unnaturally. My stomach lurched. In the brief instant of illumination, its pale skin seemed almost reflective, drawn tight over bony joints. One arm rose slowly, impossibly long fingers reaching out toward me. The canyon plunged back into darkness. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping the flashlight. Terror surged through me, primal and urgent. I turned, breaking into a full sprint down the wash. Gravel slid beneath my boots, threatening to send me sprawling, but sheer panic drove me forward. The thing pursued, silent, swift, disturbingly agile, gaining ground with each passing second. I felt the air rush past as it lunged for me, missing by inches. I spun and fired my flare gun wildly, and the bright red glare cast shadows dancing crazily off canyon walls. In that horrifying glow, I caught a brief glimpse of it again, now even closer. Head cocked at an unnatural angle, empty eye sockets blacker than the canyon around us. The flare fizzled out, darkness closing back around me like a tomb. I ran blindly, lungs screaming for air, my injured leg throbbing in agony. Behind me, gravel shifted again, faster, heavier. It was coming. My mind screamed at me to move faster, to run until my legs gave out. Then, without warning, a bolt of lightning slammed into a cedar tree only yards away, shattering it into splinters of smoking wood and flame. Heat and light exploded, momentarily blinding me. I fell hard onto the jagged earth, hands scraped raw. When I raised my head, blinking rapidly to clear my vision, the burning tree cast an eerie glow across the wash. I saw clearly the thing behind me, frozen mid-step, recoiling from the brightness. Its elongated arms shielded its featureless face. For the first time, it hesitated. I didn't wait. Pain forgotten, I scrambled to my feet and bolted, lungs burning as though filled with fire. The canyon blurred past me, rocks and brush scraping at my skin, but adrenaline carried me forward. Behind me, the distant sound of movement faded. When dawn finally broke, pale and weak, I reached the ranger station doors, collapsing onto the dusty floor, gasping for air. Blood trickled from the reopened gash on my leg, mingling with dirt and sweat. Someone shouted for help, but the voices sounded distant, unreal. By afternoon, the park accepted my resignation without argument, my silence taken as shock or trauma. Within days, a quiet announcement went out. Backcountry camping was suspended due to fire risks and trail erosion. But those of us who knew Palo Duro Canyon understood the truth, even if none of us dared speak it aloud. I moved away to Amarillo and left the canyon behind. But some nights, especially when the heat rises and dry lightning flickers in the distance, I dream vividly of shadows moving silently along sandstone walls. Shadows that never fully reveal themselves, but whose presence lingers unmistakably in my memory. This morning wasn't much different, at least not at first. Dispatch called me at sunrise about an overdue backcountry permit near Bone Valley. Two hikers, a husband and wife from Louisville, had parked their Honda CR-V at the Noland Creek trailhead. 6 days later, no return tags, no check-in, no contact. Normally, folks either come wandering out sheepishly with an apology, or they get themselves in trouble, twisted ankles, dehydration, hypothermia. But something felt off about this one from the start. Bone Valley is isolated, hard to reach. If you pick that spot, you know what you're doing, or at least you think you do. I left my itinerary with dispatch, grabbed my gear, and headed out. The trail up from Noland Creek was overgrown, thick branches and laurel snagging at my pack and uniform sleeves. Nobody had cleared this route in months, maybe longer. By noon, the climb had me sweating through my shirt, breathing heavy. It was slow going. Every mile or so, I caught signs someone had passed recently. Small boot prints pressed into muddy soil, snapped twigs dangling freshly from trees. Near one stream, I spotted a melted lump of trail mix, the chocolate gone sticky and embedded with pine needles. They'd come this way, at least. By early evening, I reached the clearing marked on their permit application. At first glance, it was clear something had happened. The tent was half collapsed, the nylon torn along one side, shredded in jagged strips. The ground was littered with debris, cookware, clothes, a paperback novel left to swell and wrinkle in the rain. One sleeping bag remained rolled out, untouched. The other was gone entirely. I checked the area carefully, scanning the dirt and plants for blood or signs of a struggle. Nothing. But along a nearby tulip poplar tree, I saw deep gouges in the bark. Bear? Maybe, but the marks didn't match anything I'd seen before. They were wide-set and alarmingly deep. The hair on my neck prickled as I ran a finger over the splintered grooves. Behind the clearing, the brush had been pushed aside, creating a narrow corridor through dense thickets. I ducked low, peering into the shadowed path. Something big had come and gone through here, repeatedly. I debated following it, but the sun was already slipping toward the ridge, and daylight had a way of fading quickly in these valleys. Staying out here alone after dark wasn't on my list. I took detailed notes, logged coordinates, and then turned to head back. The sky was already a dim violet. As I hiked down the trail, shadows lengthened and shifted. The forest had that heavy, silent feel it gets at twilight, like the trees themselves are holding their breath. Every few minutes, I paused to look behind me, scanning the dim woods. It was then, maybe a half-mile from the campsite, that I first noticed it. Standing perfectly still, about 20 yards off the trail, was a figure. Tall, dark, unmoving. I froze, hand inching instinctively toward my sidearm. I blinked once, twice, hard. Then I raised my flashlight, heart hammering as the beam swung up. But the figure was gone. The light illuminated only stone and moss, twisted tree limbs and dense brush. I stared for a moment, trying to shake the feeling crawling down my spine. Just a trick of the fading light, I told myself, nothing more. I resumed walking, quicker now, but the next time I glanced back it was there again. Exactly the same shape, the same spot, perfectly motionless. This time, I whipped the flashlight beam across the space, hard in my throat. And again, nothing but stone, moss, and trees. The hike back was the longest I'd ever made. By the time I reached my truck at the Noland Creek trailhead, it was fully dark, and the figure, or whatever I'd seen, never appeared again. Still, when I climbed into the cab, locked the doors, and radioed dispatch, my voice was steadier than my hands. The drive back to my outpost cabin near Fontana took nearly an hour, the headlights barely piercing the dense darkness. I spent every minute trying to convince myself I'd seen nothing back there on the trail, just my imagination playing tricks after a long day. The alternative was something I wasn't ready to consider. By the time I reached the cabin, the radio crackled as dispatch confirmed my report. They said they'd send a search and rescue team to meet me at first light. That should have eased my mind. It didn't. Inside, I locked the door behind me, double-checking the latch. It was a small outpost. One room, wood-paneled, with a desk, a cot, and a modest kitchen area. Sparse, but it always felt secure. A tiny sanctuary buried deep in the mountains. Tonight, though, it felt exposed. I spread a map of the park on the desk. tracing routes with my finger. Outside, the woods stood silent. The usual nighttime sounds, crickets, distant owls, were absent. There was only a heavy silence pressing in from every direction. Around midnight, as fatigue finally began to settle in, I heard footsteps. They sounded like bare feet, quick and light, circling the cabin. I straightened instantly, pulse jumping. A bear, I thought, or maybe a coyote. But as I listened, my heart sank. The rhythm wasn't animal, it was paced, purposeful. I moved quietly to the window, peering cautiously through a crack in the blinds. I saw nothing but shadows. The urge to fling the door open was overwhelming, but my training screamed at me to stay put. Bolted doors were better than an open forest. 10 minutes later, the power flickered and died. I sat frozen at the desk, the room swallowed by darkness. Reaching blindly into a drawer, I pulled out the emergency radio and flicked the switch. Static buzzed softly, then cut out. Dead. That shouldn't happen. These radios always worked. From above, a sharp creak echoed through the ceiling. Something was on the roof. My pulse thudded in my ears. The footsteps overhead moved slowly from one side to the other, pausing, then shifting again. Whatever was up there had weight. It sounded heavy, solid. My instincts screamed at me to stay inside, to wait it out. Then, just as suddenly as they started, the footsteps stopped. I waited, breath shallow, ears straining. Seconds stretched into minutes. Just as I began to believe it had moved on, a voice erupted from the trees, clear and sharp as a rifle crack. "Eric," my blood turned cold. The voice wasn't from dispatch, wasn't from another ranger. I knew exactly who it sounded like. My brother Josh. He'd died 10 years ago on a rescue gone wrong in Shenandoah. Fell into a ravine during a midnight search. His voice had been silent for a decade. And yet, here in the middle of the Smokies, I heard it unmistakably. "Eric, come out here!" Every fiber of my being wanted to shout back, but I knew better. I forced myself to stay still, heart hammering so loudly it felt like it echoed off the walls. Whatever was out there was trying to draw me into the dark, and I wasn't taking the bait. The voice grew distant, gradually fading into nothing. Still, I didn't move, didn't sleep. I just sat rigid at the desk, listening until dawn crept over the ridgeline, spilling soft, gray light through the blinds. When the search and rescue team arrived at sunrise, radios crackling and voices calm, I unlocked the cabin door and stepped into the cool morning air, my face a mask of calm I didn't feel. As we loaded our gear and started toward Bone Valley, I made myself a promise. This would be the last backcountry patrol I'd ever do alone. The morning sunlight was sharp but did nothing to chase away the chill from the night before. As the search and rescue team gathered at the trailhead, I kept quiet about the voice I'd heard. There was no point spooking them before we even started. 4 seasoned rescuers and a cadaver dog, a Belgian Malinois named Riggs, set out with me up the winding trail. Riggs moved confidently ahead, nose to the ground. When we reached the campsite, it looked exactly as I'd left it. The torn tent, the unsettling claw marks. One of the rescuers muttered, "Never seen marks like that." Riggs stiffened suddenly, his eyes fixed on the dense laurel beyond the campsite. His handler gave a sharp nod, and Riggs darted into the brush, the team moving quickly to follow. We pushed into the tangled undergrowth, following the dog's progress along the narrow corridor of disturbed earth I'd seen yesterday. The path twisted through the thickets and ended abruptly at the base of a steep, rocky bluff. Riggs stopped, body low, nose trained at a shadowed spot below a moss-covered ledge. I stepped forward, chest tightening. Behind a curtain of tangled vines, a small cave mouth yawned open, black and damp. We ducked carefully inside, flashlights illuminating walls lined with bones. Animal bones, gnawed and cracked. Near the back of the shallow cave, someone had arranged a small living area. Torn clothing, dirty blankets, and bits of camping gear were strewn across the uneven floor. "Got something," one of the rescuers called quietly. He held up a weathered backpack, its fabric crusted with dirt. Carefully, he unzipped it, pulling out a worn wallet and a crumbling permit tag. My breath caught when he passed the permit to me. The date stamped on it read clearly, May 14th, 1998. We'd found gear belonging to Michael Ferris, a backpacker who had disappeared more than 2 decades ago on this very trail. The realization that someone, somehow, had remained hidden here all that time made my skin crawl. Riggs pawed at something else. His handler crouched beside him, retrieving a ripped boot from beneath a pile of animal remains. It matched the size and style of footwear described in the missing couple's report. There were no bodies, just signs that something had claimed this place for years. By midday, we radioed for forensic support. The team documented everything, packing it for the lab. Eventually, we left the cave behind, but I knew its image would be burned into my mind forever. Back at the station that evening, after hours of interviews and uneasy glances, I submitted my request for immediate transfer to a front desk role. There was no hesitation. I'd done my time. I was done with the backcountry, done with those quiet trails and lonely nights. In the weeks that followed, the story spread in hushed tones among park employees, but no arrests were ever made. The investigation stalled, unable to offer closure beyond what we'd found. But the truth was clear enough to me, obvious in every shadowy corner of the Smokies. Someone had survived out there for decades, hidden from sight. Someone who knew these mountains better than anyone. Someone who, I was certain,